Picture this scene. The year is 1492. A woman stands in the center of a crowded marketplace in Florence. Her wrists are bound with rough rope that has already rubbed her skin raw. Her hair, once her pride, has been violently shorn to the scalp, leaving bloody patches where the shears cut too deep. She has been stripped to the waist, her bare skin exposed to the February cold and the eyes of hundreds of townspeople who have gathered for the spectacle. Rotten vegetables fly through the air. A cabbage strikes her face, the putrid juice mixing with her tears. Men shout obscenities while their wives watch in silence, knowing that but for fortune they could be standing in her place. Children throw stones, encouraged by their parents who tell them this is what happens to bad women. The local priest stands on a platform, reading from scripture about the wages of sin while the crowd grows more violent with each verse. Her crime was adultery. Or rather, her crime was being accused of adultery by a husband who wanted to marry someone younger and wealthier. No trial was held. No evidence was presented. His word alone was enough to condemn her to this public torture. But this is not even close to the worst fate that awaited women accused of infidelity throughout history. Across every civilization, on every continent, for thousands of years, nothing provoked more horrific punishments than accusations of female unfaithfulness. From the river trials of ancient Mesopotamia to the burning stakes of medieval Europe, from the stoning grounds of the Middle East to the drowning cages of Germany, women accused of straying-faced tortures so revolting that even hardened historians struggle to document them fully. The punishments were never just about the alleged crime. They were about control, about terror, about keeping half the population in submission through spectacular displays of cruelty. What you are about to learn will shock you, not because these events are hidden or secret, but because they happened so frequently, so openly, and for so long that they became normalized parts of civilization. These were not aberrations or excesses. They were the law. They were tradition. They were considered moral and necessary by the very societies that created them. And the last punishment we will cover is so grotesque, so utterly dehumanizing, that even the chroniclers of the time hesitated to describe it in full detail. It was not death they feared to document, but something far worse than death. Something that turned women into living warnings, breathing monuments to male control, walking corpses who were denied even the mercy of the grave. Before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. 3,800 years ago, in the cradle of civilization itself, King Hammurabi of Babylon carved his laws into stone. Among the 282 laws that would govern one of history's first great empires, several dealt specifically with female adultery. The punishments were not just severe. They were designed to be divine theater, turning the gods themselves into executioners. Law 132 states that if a woman is accused of adultery but not caught in the act, she must throw herself into the river. This was not mere execution. This was trial by ordeal, where the river god would determine guilt or innocence. If she drowned, her guilt was proven and her death was justified. If by some miracle she survived, the gods had declared her innocent, but survival was almost impossible. The accused woman would be brought to the banks of the Euphrates at dawn. The entire community would gather, turning judgment into entertainment. She would be stripped of her clothing, her hands bound behind her back, sometimes with stones tied to her ankles to ensure she would sink. The priests would chant prayers, calling upon Enki, the river god, to reveal the truth through her fate. Then she would be thrown in, not pushed, not lowered, but thrown with force into the deepest part of the current. The crowd would watch as she struggled, as her head went under, as her body fought desperately against the bindings and the weight. Some would cheer, others would pray. Many would place bets on how long she would last. When her body finally went still and sank beneath the surface, it would be left there for 3 days. The river was considered sacred, and retrieving the body too soon would anger the gods. After 3 days, what remained would be dragged out, bloated beyond recognition, flesh already beginning to separate from bone. The corpse would not receive burial rites. Instead, it would be displayed as a warning to other women, left to rot in public view until the smell became unbearable or wild animals carried away the pieces. But here is the truly insidious part of this law. The accusation alone destroyed the woman's life. Even if she somehow survived the river ordeal, she would return to a community that had watched her thrown naked into the water, that had cheered for her death. Her property would have been seized. Her children would be considered tainted. No man would associate with her for fear of being contaminated by her shame. Survival meant living death, social execution that lasted until actual death finally brought mercy. Archaeological evidence from ancient Babylon shows mass burial sites near rivers, containing primarily female skeletons, many with signs of drowning and bound limbs. Conservative estimates suggest thousands of women died in river ordeals during Hammurabi's reign alone. But the practice did not end with him. It spread throughout Mesopotamia, adopted by the Assyrians, the Hittites, and eventually making its way into European law where it would persist for another 3,000 years. The river ordeal was particularly cruel because it exploited women's lower body mass and muscle density compared to men. Women naturally have higher body fat percentages, which should help with buoyancy, but when hands are bound and weights are added, this advantage becomes meaningless. The priests who administered these ordeals knew this. They designed them to be essentially impossible to survive while maintaining the fiction that divine justice was being served. We have recovered clay tablets from ancient Sumeria that record the last words of women about to face the river ordeal. One reads, "I call upon Inanna to witness my innocence, though I know the river will take me. Tell my daughters to be silent, always silent, for silence is their only protection." Another says simply, "My husband tires of me. The river is his solution. The gods are his excuse." But if drowning in rivers was how Mesopotamia dealt with accused adulteresses, Rome preferred something more visible, more permanent, and infinitely more cruel. In ancient Rome, a husband's power over his wife's body was absolute. The concept of paterfamilias gave the male head of household the power of life and death over everyone under his roof, including his wife, children, and slaves. But when it came to adultery, Roman law did not demand death. It demanded something worse. It demanded that the woman be marked, mutilated, transformed into a living symbol of shame that would walk the streets as a warning to others. The Lex Julia de Adulterius coercendus, passed by Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE, gave husbands the legal right to kill their wives if caught in the act of adultery, but killing was considered the merciful option. More commonly, husbands chose mutilation, specifically the cutting off of the nose, a practice called rhinotomy. This was not random violence. It was calculated destruction of the one thing Roman society valued in women above all else: beauty. The process was ritualized and public. The accused woman would be brought to the forum, the heart of civic life. Her husband would stand before the crowd and recite her crimes, real or imagined. Then, while strong men held her down, he would take a sharp blade and slice off her nose, sometimes her lips and ears as well. The blood would pour down her face, onto her clothes, pooling on the stones beneath her. The crowd would cheer this display of masculine authority, of order restored. But the mutilation was just the beginning. The woman would then be stripped naked and paraded through the streets on a donkey, facing backwards, while citizens threw garbage and excrement at her. Signs would be hung around her neck, describing her crimes in graphic detail. This procession would last hours, winding through every neighborhood, ensuring that everyone saw her shame. Some husbands got creative with their punishments. We have records of women having their heads shaved and the word adultera branded onto their foreheads with hot iron. Others had their cheeks sliced open from mouth to ear, creating a permanent grimace that would mark them forever. One particularly sadistic case involved a senator who had his wife's eyelids cut off, so she could never hide from the stares of those who judged her. The physician Galen wrote about treating women after such punishments, describing wounds that would not heal, infections that spread across the face, women who could no longer eat solid food because their mouths had been too damaged. Many died from infection within weeks. Those who survived faced a lifetime of disfigurement that made them outcasts, even among other outcasts. They could not remarry, could not work in any respectable occupation, could not even beg effectively because their appearance was so disturbing that people would flee rather than give them coins. Wealthy women sometimes faced a different fate. To preserve family honor and avoid public scandal, they would be executed in private gardens, their deaths made to look like suicide. The method was usually forced consumption of poison or opening of veins in a warm bath. But even these private executions had their own cruelties. The woman would be forced to write a confession admitting her guilt and absolving her husband of any wrongdoing. She would have to distribute her property according to his wishes, often leaving everything to him rather than to her children. Only then would she be allowed the mercy of death. Roman writers like Juvenal and Martial wrote satires about these punishments, not condemning them but mocking the women who suffered them. They turned mutilated faces into jokes, writing verses about how a woman without a nose could never again smell her own shame. This cultural mockery ensured that even sympathy for these victims was dangerous, marking anyone who showed compassion as potentially subversive. Archaeological excavations in Pompeii have uncovered graffiti that lists local women who had been punished for adultery, complete with crude drawings of their mutilations. These were not hidden in private spaces, but painted on the walls of public buildings, bathhouses, and marketplaces. The shame was meant to be eternal, carved into the very stones of the city. But Rome, at least, allowed husbands to choose between death and disfigurement. In Byzantium and medieval Europe, the choice was made for them, and it was always the most public, most humiliating option available. By the time the Roman Empire split and evolved into Byzantium in the east and various kingdoms in the west, the punishment of adultery had become even more theatrical. It was no longer enough to mutilate or kill. The punishment had to be a public performance, a morality play where the woman's suffering taught lessons about divine justice and social order. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, adulteresses faced a punishment called the Parade of Shame. The woman would be stripped completely naked, her body smeared with a mixture of tar and excrement that would stick to her skin and hair. She would then be placed backwards on a donkey, her hands tied to her ankles so she was forced into an agonizing bent position. A crown of thorns or dried brambles would be placed on her head, mocking Christ's crown and suggesting she was the opposite of holy. The procession would begin at dawn and last until sunset, 12 hours of exposure and humiliation. Musicians would walk ahead, playing discordant music to announce her approach. Children would be given special rattles and noisemakers to add to the cacophony. At each major intersection, the procession would stop, and a herald would read out her crimes in explicit detail, often embellished with fictional elements to make them more salacious. But the true genius of Byzantine cruelty was what happened after the parade. The woman would not be executed or released. Instead, she would be installed in a special kind of brothel reserved for the lowest form of prostitution. She would be available to any man for any act, no matter how degrading, for the price of a single copper coin. This was not just sexual slavery. It was designed to break her completely, to erase any trace of the person she had been. In medieval Europe, the punishments took on a distinctly religious character. The church had become the primary authority on moral matters, and adultery was seen not just as a crime against a husband, but as a sin against God himself. The punishments reflected this theological framework, turning suffering into a form of perverted penance. The cucking stool was one of the most common devices. This was a chair attached to a long beam that could be used to repeatedly plunge a woman into a river or pond. But this was not the quick drowning of Mesopotamia. This was slow, controlled, designed to bring the woman to the edge of death over and over again. She would be strapped into the chair, unable to move, and then lowered into the water until she began to drown. Just before she lost consciousness, she would be raised up, allowed a few gasping breaths, and then plunged back down. This could go on for hours. Each immersion lasted longer than the last. The crowd would cheer and jeer, placing bets on how many dunkings she could survive. Local vendors sold food and ale, turning the torture into a festival. Children were brought to watch and learn what happened to immoral women. The woman's own children were often forced to stand in the front row, watching their mothers' repeated near drownings. Those who survived the cucking stool faced other humiliations. Head shaving was universal, but it was done with deliberate cruelty. Instead of simply cutting the hair short, it would be ripped out in chunks, leaving bloody patches of scalp. Hot tar would sometimes be poured on the bald head, which would then be covered with feathers, creating a grotesque parody of hair that could not be removed without tearing away skin. Branding was another favorite. Not just a simple mark, but elaborate designs that told the story of the woman's supposed crimes. An adulteress might have the letter A burned into her forehead, but also images of devils and serpents branded onto her cheeks, breasts, and thighs. Each brand was applied slowly, the iron heated to just the right temperature to ensure the mark would be raised and visible forever. In some regions, women were locked into devices called branks, or scold's bridles. These were metal cages that enclosed the head with a spiked plate that pressed down on the tongue, making speech impossible and eating agonizing. The woman would be led through town wearing this device, unable to defend herself verbally, unable to scream, only able to moan through the metal that trapped her voice. The stocks and pillory added another dimension of horror. The woman would be locked into the wooden frame in the town square, bent at an uncomfortable angle, unable to move for days. But she was not just displayed, she was available. Anyone could do anything to her short of killing her. Men would sexually assault her, women would beat her, children would throw stones and excrement. She could not defend herself, could not even move to avoid the blows. But even these elaborate public punishments pale in comparison to what awaited women when religious fervor demanded not just punishment, but purification by fire. Fire has always held a special place in human concepts of punishment and purification. For women accused of adultery, particularly noble women, whose high status made simple physical punishment insufficient, burning alive became the ultimate statement of divine judgment. The flames were not just execution. They were transformation, turning sinful flesh into smoke and ash that would rise to heaven as a warning to God himself about the consequences of female desire. In medieval Europe, the burning of adulteresses was reserved for special cases. When a noble woman was accused of adultery that could call into question the legitimacy of heirs, when a woman was accused of adultery with multiple partners, or when adultery was combined with accusations of witchcraft, the stake awaited. The preparation for burning was as much a part of the punishment as the flames themselves. The condemned woman would first be subjected to examination. This meant torture to extract a full confession. Red-hot pincers would tear flesh from her arms and breasts. Her feet would be crushed in iron boots that could be tightened with screws. Water would be forced down her throat until her stomach nearly burst. Then she would be beaten to force it back up, only to have the process repeated. The confession extracted under such torture would then be read publicly as if it were voluntary truth. On the day of execution, she would be dressed in a shift covered with sulfur and pitch to ensure the flames would catch quickly and burn hotter. She would be paraded through the streets to the stake, where bundles of wood had been arranged with scientific precision. Dry wood at the bottom for quick ignition, green wood in the middle to create smoke, and more dry wood on top to ensure complete consumption of the body. As the flames rose, the crowd would watch her skin blister and bubble. They would smell her hair catch fire, that distinctive acrid scent that survivors never forgot. They would hear her screams change as the fire reached her throat, turning from human cries to animal sounds and finally to silence. But even after she stopped screaming, her body would continue to move, muscles contracting in the heat, creating the illusion of continued life that horrified and fascinated observers. The executioners were skilled at controlling the fire. A quick death was considered merciful, taking perhaps 15 to 20 minutes. But for particularly despised women, they would use techniques to prolong the agony. Wet wood to create more smoke and less heat, causing slow suffocation. Placing the woman higher on the stake so the flames would burn her legs first, while leaving her vital organs intact longer. Adding green branches that would create intense smoke to blind and choke her without killing quickly. In the Islamic world, stoning became the preferred method for punishing adultery, a practice derived from interpretations of religious law that demanded community participation in the execution. Stoning was not just death by rocks, it was death by community, where every thrown stone represented society's judgment on the condemned woman's actions. The preparation for stoning was precisely regulated. The woman would be wrapped in a white shroud and buried up to her waist or chest in the ground, ensuring she could not run or even fall over when struck. The stones themselves had to be specifically selected, not so small that they would merely cause pain without progressing toward death, but not so large that they would kill quickly with a single blow. Each stone had to be roughly the size of a tangerine, small enough to be thrown accurately but large enough to cause significant damage. The stoning would begin with ritual pronouncements, prayers, and readings from religious texts. Then the first stone would be thrown by the accuser or the religious authority. This would signal the crowd to begin. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of stones would fly through the air, striking the woman's head, chest, and arms as she tried desperately to protect herself with her bound hands. The medical reality of stoning is particularly horrific. The repeated impacts cause massive internal bleeding, broken bones, and traumatic brain injury, but death rarely comes quickly. The woman remains conscious through most of it, feeling each strike, tasting blood in her mouth as internal organs rupture, experiencing the peculiar sensation of bones breaking inside her body. The crowd continues, throwing stones long after movement stops, ensuring complete destruction of the body. Contemporary accounts describe the sounds of stoning, not just the impact of stones on flesh, but the wet sounds, as tissue tears, the cracking of bones, the gurgling as blood fills the lungs. Some observers noted that women often stopped screaming fairly quickly, not from death but from jaw fractures that made vocalization impossible. They would continue to live and feel for many more minutes in silent agony. In certain regions, the stoning would be followed by additional desecration. The body would be left exposed for days, allowing birds and animals to feed on it. The remains would then be burned and the ashes scattered, denying the woman any form of burial or memorial. Her name would be forbidden to speak, effectively erasing her from existence entirely. But death, no matter how horrible, at least had an endpoint. In many cultures, the punishment for female adultery was specifically designed to avoid death, to keep the woman alive in a state of permanent humiliation and pain. Throughout the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent, the preferred punishment for female adultery was not death but disfigurement, so severe that death would have been merciful. The cutting off of noses, ears, and lips was not random violence, but calculated destruction designed to mark women permanently as moral failures, while keeping them alive as walking warnings to others. In Mughal India, the practice of nakkhatna, or nose cutting, was institutionalized into law. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb specifically codified that women convicted of adultery should have their noses amputated as a middle punishment between warning and execution. But the term middle grotesquely understates the horror of the practice. The nose is central to facial symmetry, essential for proper breathing, and in Indian culture considered the seat of honor and respect. The cutting was done with a specially designed curved blade called a nakatar. The woman would be held down by multiple men while the executioner, often a barber, surgeon, would slice through cartilage and bone in a single motion designed to remove the entire nose, leaving a gaping hole in the center of the face. The bleeding was profuse, and many women died from blood loss or shock. Those who survived faced a lifetime of medical complications. Without a nose, every breath becomes laborious. The nose filters, warms, and humidifies air before it reaches the lungs. Without it, cold air strikes the throat directly, causing constant irritation and infection. Eating becomes difficult as the sense of smell, crucial to taste and appetite, is destroyed. Speaking changes as nasal consonants become impossible to pronounce correctly. The woman becomes marked not just visually but audibly, her voice forever marking her as punished. But the medical consequences pale beside the social destruction. In cultures where women's value was tied to beauty and marriageability, a woman without a nose became untouchable. She could not appear in public without causing revulsion. She could not work in any occupation that required face-to-face interaction. She could not even beg effectively, as people would flee rather than risk looking at her destroyed face. We have documented accounts from British colonial officers who witnessed these punishments and tried to provide medical aid to victims. One writes of finding a young woman, perhaps 16 years old, sitting by a roadside with blood still streaming from where her nose had been removed an hour before. She had been accused of smiling at a man who was not her husband. The husband had performed the amputation himself with a farming sickle, taking not just her nose, but also her upper lip, leaving her teeth permanently exposed in a skull-like grin. The practice was not limited to rural areas or lower classes. Noble women faced the same punishments, though sometimes with additional refinements. One account from 18th century Delhi describes a nobleman's wife accused of adultery having not just her nose, but also her ears, eyelids, and lips removed, essentially erasing her face while leaving her alive. She was then locked in a special room in the palace where she was kept alive for years, fed through a tube, a living ghost hidden from the world. In Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan, the practice evolved to include additional mutilations. Women might have their fingers amputated joint by joint, their tongues split, their breasts cut off. Each mutilation had symbolic meaning. Fingers that had touched another man, tongues that had spoken sweet words, breasts that had given pleasure. The woman's body became a text of her supposed crimes, readable by anyone who saw her. Even attempts at medical reconstruction carry their own horrors. Traditional attempts to create prosthetic noses from wood or metal often led to infection. Modern plastic surgery, where available, requires multiple operations and can never fully restore appearance or function. The woman remains marked forever, her punishment continuing long after the initial wound has healed. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of mutilation is how it spread beyond punishment into threat. Husbands would keep special blades visible in the home, a constant reminder to wives of what awaited them if they strayed. Mothers would tell daughters about the noseless women hidden away in back rooms, teaching them that their faces, their beauty, their very identity existed only at the pleasure of the men who controlled them. In China, the control of women's bodies took a different but equally horrific form, where feet became the focus of punishment and control. In imperial China, the practice of footbinding already represented a form of control over women's bodies that bordered on torture. But for women accused of adultery, the manipulation of their bound feet became a specific form of punishment that combined excruciating pain with permanent immobilization, ensuring they could never stray again, literally or figuratively. Normal footbinding, practiced on girls from ages 4 to 9, involved breaking the arch of the foot and folding the toes under, then binding them tightly to prevent growth. The ideal golden lotus foot measured 3 inches long. Women with bound feet walked with a distinctive, swaying gait that was considered erotic, though it was actually the result of constant pain and instability. But for adulteresses, the binding went far beyond the normal practice. Women accused of infidelity would have their already bound feet rebroken and rebound in positions designed to maximize pain and disability. The toes would be folded completely under the sole and bound so tightly that they would eventually rot off. The arch would be broken in multiple places, creating a foot that folded nearly in half. Additional bindings would extend up the leg, cutting off circulation and causing the flesh to atrophy. The process was done slowly, over weeks or months, allowing the woman to experience every moment of her foot's destruction. Each day the bindings would be tightened a fraction more. The woman would feel her bones grinding against each other, her flesh slowly dying, infections setting in as tissue died from lack of blood flow. The smell of rotting flesh would fill her room, marking her shame for anyone who came near. Contemporary accounts describe women screaming for days as their feet were restructured. The pain was so intense that many lost consciousness repeatedly, only to be revived and have the binding continue. Some begged for death, rather than endure another day of tightening. But death was not the point. The point was to create a woman so crippled that she could barely move from room to room, let alone leave the house to meet a lover. Women who survived this punishment often lost not just toes, but entire portions of their feet to gangrene. They would spend the rest of their lives unable to walk more than a few steps without assistance. Every movement would be agony, a permanent reminder of their alleged crime. They became prisoners in their own homes, dependent on the very families they had supposedly betrayed for every basic need. But the foot-binding punishment was often just the beginning. Adulteresses in China faced additional penalties that turned them into profit centers for their families or communities. Many were sold to brothels, not as courtesans who might maintain some dignity, but as the lowest form of prostitute available for any act, no matter how degrading. Their destroyed feet meant they could not run away, could barely stand, making them perfect victims for continuous exploitation. The brothels that specialized in adulteresses were particularly horrific. The women would be displayed in cages or behind bars, their mutilated feet exposed to show their status as punished women. Customers paid not for pleasure, but for the opportunity to inflict additional punishment on women already condemned by society. These establishments operated legally, often with government licenses, turning the punishment of female adultery into a regulated industry. Some regions had traveling exhibitions of adulteresses, where women with destroyed feet would be carried from town to town in cages, displayed as moral lessons. People would pay to view them, to hear their confessions, to throw objects at them. Children would be brought to see what happened to immoral women. The women would be forced to tell their stories over and over, each telling, adding details to please the crowd, truth becoming irrelevant in the face of entertainment. The psychological impact of foot destruction went beyond physical disability. In Chinese culture, a woman's feet were considered deeply intimate, hidden even from husbands except during sexual encounters. The forced exposure and destruction of feet represented a form of sexual humiliation that cannot be easily understood outside the cultural context. It was equivalent to permanent sexual assault, visible to everyone who saw the woman's destroyed gait. Medical texts from the Ming and Qing dynasties describe attempts to treat women whose feet had been destroyed as punishment. The physicians note the impossibility of restoration, the permanent nerve damage, the chronic infections that resisted all treatment. They describe women who decades after their punishment still woke, screaming from phantom pain in toes that had long since rotted away. But even the horrors of footbinding pale compared to what awaited women in medieval Europe's most sadistic innovation: the drowning cages and live burial. The medieval European mind, with its fusion of Christian theology and Germanic brutality, created punishments for adultery that seemed designed to test the very limits of human suffering. Among these, the drowning cages and live burial stand out as particularly horrific, combining the primal fears of drowning and suffocation with the theatrical cruelty that characterized medieval justice. The drowning cage, used primarily in Germany and Eastern Europe from the 13th to 17th centuries, was a masterpiece of engineering devoted to human suffering. These were not simple cages, but carefully designed instruments that maximized both the duration and intensity of the drowning process. Made of iron bars spaced just widely enough that water could flow through freely, but closely enough that the victim could not squeeze through, even when desperate survival instinct made them try. The cage would be attached to a long beam that extended over a river or pond. The woman would be stripped naked and locked inside, her body pressed against the cold iron bars. The cage was designed to be form-fitting, preventing much movement but not so tight as to cause immediate death. The victim needed to be conscious and struggling for the punishment to achieve its full effect. The lowering into water was done slowly, incrementally. First the feet, then the knees, the waist, the chest. At each stage, the woman would feel the cold water rising, knowing what was coming but powerless to prevent it. The crowd would watch, often taking bets on how long she would last once fully submerged. When the water reached neck level, the real horror began. The cage would be lowered until the woman's face was just below the surface. She could see the sky through the water, distorted and unreachable. She would hold her breath as long as possible, her lungs burning, her body convulsing against the iron bars. Finally, inevitably, she would breathe in water. But the cage would then be raised, allowing her to cough out water and gasp air before being lowered again. This cycle would repeat dozens of times. Each drowning lasted longer as the woman weakened. Water filled her lungs repeatedly, causing a sensation survivors of near drowning describe as the worst pain imaginable, like breathing fire. Her struggles would gradually weaken from violent thrashing to feeble movements to mere twitching. But the operators were skilled at reading these signs, raising the cage just enough to prevent actual death until the prescribed number of immersions was complete. Some women survived the drowning cage, though survival might have been worse than death. The repeated near drownings caused permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Lungs, scarred from water inhalation, would never function properly again. Many survivors went mad from the experience, spending their remaining years terrified of water, unable to drink without panic, screaming at the sight of rain. But for some women, even the drowning cage was considered insufficient. For them, medieval justice reserved its ultimate horror: burial alive. This punishment, used primarily for adulteresses, who were also accused of murdering their husbands or children, combined every primal fear into a single, extended death sentence. The burial ritual was elaborate and carefully staged. The woman would be forced to dig her own grave, a process that could take hours with the simple tools provided. She would dig knowing that each shovelful of earth removed brought her closer to her own death. The crowd would watch, sometimes for hours, as she worked. Some would mock her, others would pray. Children would be brought to watch and learn. Once the grave was deep enough, usually about 6 feet, the woman would be forced to lie down in it. She would not be in a coffin. She would feel the earth directly against her body. Then the burial would begin, but not quickly. The earth would be added slowly, a few handfuls at a time, first covering her feet, then her legs, her torso, her arms. She would feel the weight increasing, pressing down on her chest, making each breath harder. When only her head remained above ground, the burial would pause. This was the moment for final words, for confession, for pleas that would go unheeded. Some women prayed. Others cursed. Many just screamed. Then the final earth would be added, covering her face, filling her mouth and nose as she tried desperately to turn her head, to find a pocket of air that did not exist. But the horror did not end with the covering. The woman would remain conscious underground for several minutes, possibly longer if air pockets formed. She would be in complete darkness, unable to move, feeling the earth pressing in from all sides. She would suffocate slowly, her body's desperate need for air causing her to inhale soil, filling her lungs with dirt. The crowd above would stand on the fresh grave, feeling for movement, listening for sounds that would not come through the packed earth. Archaeological excavations have found the remains of women buried alive, their positions telling the story of their final moments. Hands clawed into fists, having tried to dig upward. Mouths filled with earth from desperate attempts to breathe. Bones broken from the violent convulsions of suffocation. These remains were often found outside consecrated ground, denied Christian burial even in death. Some variations of live burial were even more elaborate. In parts of Eastern Europe, women would be buried with their heads above ground, but their bodies completely immobilized by earth. They would be left to die of exposure, thirst, and hunger over several days. Birds would peck at their eyes. Insects would crawl into their mouths and noses. They would be conscious for most of it, unable to move, unable to die quickly, unable to do anything but wait for death while the community went about its daily life around them. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of both drowning cages and live burial was the involvement of the woman's own family. Husbands were often required to operate the drowning cage or throw the first handful of earth. Children were forced to watch their mothers die, to participate in the execution, to learn that this is what happens to women who transgress. Sons would be made to help fill the grave. Daughters would be told that they too could end up in the earth if they followed their mother's example. The last documented case of live burial for adultery in Europe occurred in 1734 in Germany, though unofficial cases likely continued in remote areas much longer. The woman, whose name was deliberately erased from records, was buried alive after confessing under torture to adultery with 3 different men. Later investigations suggested she had been tortured into false confession by a husband who wanted to marry a younger woman with a larger dowry. But by then, she had been underground for months, her grave unmarked, her story known only through a priest's private confession discovered centuries later. Yet even these deaths, horrible as they were, at least had an ending. The worst punishment was not death, but eternal living degradation. Throughout history, across every culture that punished female adultery, there existed a punishment considered worse than death, worse than mutilation, worse than any single moment of agony. This was the sentence of forced prostitution and sexual slavery, where the woman's punishment became a daily recurring nightmare that could last decades, ending only when her body finally gave out from abuse, disease, or despair. In Byzantium, the system was formalized into law. Women convicted of adultery who were not executed could be sentenced to the public brothels, special establishments run by the state where the condemned served anyone who could pay the minimal fee. These were not the higher-class establishments where courtesans might maintain some dignity. These were abuse factories where women had no right to refuse any customer or any act. The Byzantine legal code specified that adulteresses in public brothels must be available from sunrise to sunset every day except religious holidays. They could not refuse any customer, regardless of disease, violence, or perversion. They received no payment. All money went to the state. They were marked with special tattoos on their faces and hands, identifying them as condemned women, ensuring they could never escape their status even if they somehow left the brothel. The physical reality of this existence defies comprehension. Women would service 30, 40, 50 men per day. Their bodies would be torn, infected, constantly bleeding. Pregnancy was common, and children born in the brothels were automatically slaves, often raised to the same fate as their mothers. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Most women did not survive 5 years. Those who did often wished they had not. We have testimony from John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople, who visited these brothels not to use them but to document the conditions as part of his campaign against them. He described women so broken they no longer seemed human, lying in their own waste, covered in wounds and diseases, some having lost their minds entirely from the constant abuse. He wrote of one woman who had been there for 10 years and no longer remembered her own name, responding only to degrading epithets customers used. In medieval India, the sentence of temple prostitution turned religious devotion into sexual slavery. Women accused of adultery could be dedicated to temples as devadasis, literally servants of God, but in practice forced to provide sexual services to priests and pilgrims. This was framed as religious duty, a way for the woman to atone for her sins through serving the representatives of the divine. The initiation ceremony was a cruel parody of marriage. The woman would be dressed as a bride and married to the temple deity, usually represented by a stone or wooden idol. She would then be available to any man who made a donation to the temple. The priests took first rites, often every night, with pilgrims and other visitors taking turns during the day. The woman could never marry a mortal man, never leave the temple, never refuse anyone who claimed religious purpose for their assault. The children of devadasis belonged to the temple and faced the same fate. Girls would be raised to become devadasis themselves. Boys would be castrated and serve as temple attendants. Generations of families were trapped in this system, their original crime often forgotten, the punishment becoming hereditary. Some temple records show families serving in sexual slavery for over 200 years. The original adultery accusation lost to time, but the punishment continuing through bloodlines. In the Ottoman Empire, adulteresses might be sentenced to the military brothels that followed armies on campaign. These women, called camp followers in sanitized historical texts, were actually condemned prisoners forced to service hundreds of soldiers. They marched with the armies, available to any soldier at any time. During battles, they would be left unprotected, often captured by enemy forces, who would use them the same way before killing them or selling them to continue their punishment under new masters. The conditions in military brothels were even worse than stationary ones. The women marched during the day, often in chains, and serviced soldiers all night. They received minimal food, no medical care, no rest. When they became too sick or injured to continue, they were abandoned by the roadside to die. Their bodies were not buried, left as warnings and food for scavengers, but perhaps the most systematic and horrific system of punitive prostitution existed in Victorian England, though historians have long tried to minimize or deny it. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of prostitution and subject her to forced medical examinations. But buried in the legal language was provision for women convicted of adultery to be confined in what were called certified hospitals, but were actually prison brothels. These institutions, operating under medical authority, claimed to be treating venereal disease. In reality, they were places where condemned women were made available to men who paid fees to the hospital for therapeutic services. The women were experimented upon, subjected to mercury treatments that destroyed their bodies, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and constant sexual assault disguised as medical examination. The records of these institutions, long hidden in archives and only recently analyzed, show that thousands of women passed through them. The death rate was over 60% within 2 years of admission. Those who survived were often released, with bodies so damaged they could not function in normal society. Many committed suicide within weeks of release. Others were recommitted on new charges, trapped in the system until death. What made forced prostitution particularly cruel as punishment was its duration and its destruction of identity. Death, even slow death, has an endpoint. Mutilation, horrible as it was a single event that could be survived. But forced prostitution was renewed daily. Every sunrise brought new degradation. Every customer was a new violation. The woman's body became not her own, but a public resource for abuse. The psychological destruction was complete. Women in forced prostitution reported feeling like they had died, but their bodies kept moving. They described watching themselves from outside, unable to connect with the flesh that was constantly invaded. Many lost the ability to speak, to think, to remember who they had been before. They became exactly what the punishment intended: living warnings, breathing examples of the price of female transgression, walking corpses denied even the mercy of death. Some women tried to escape through suicide, but even this was prevented. In Byzantine brothels, women were chained at night and watched constantly. In Indian temples, they were given food mixed with opium to keep them docile but alive. In military camps, they were guarded more carefully than weapons or gold. Society was determined that they should suffer for as long as physically possible. The men who used these condemned women knew exactly what they were participating in. This was not hidden or disguised. Men would specifically seek out condemned adulteresses because abusing them was seen as participating in justice. Using these women was viewed as a moral act, helping to punish sin. The worse the abuse, the more righteous the man could feel. They were not just raping, they were enforcing divine and social order through abuse. We return now to that marketplace in Florence in 1492. The woman bound and stripped and pelted with filth has endured her public humiliation, but her punishment is not over. It will never be over. She will carry the marks of this day for the rest of her life, whether that is measured in years or days. Her shorn head will mark her when hair regrows irregularly from scarred scalp. Her branded skin will announce her shame to everyone she meets. Her broken spirit will prevent her from ever again being the person she was before this morning. If she is lucky, she will be allowed to return to her family as a broken servant, forever grateful for any mercy shown. If she is unlucky, she faces one of the fates we have chronicled: drowning, burning, mutilation, slavery. Either way, her life as a full human being is over. She has become a lesson, a warning, a symbol of what happens when women step outside the boundaries men have drawn for them. This was not justice, it was theater. Every punishment we have described was designed not just to hurt the individual woman, but to terrify all women. The public nature, the involvement of communities, the ritualistic elements, all serve to transform individual punishment into collective instruction. Women watching these punishments learned that their bodies were not their own, that their sexuality existed only within male-defined boundaries, that stepping outside those boundaries meant not just death but destruction of identity itself. The accusations themselves were often false, and everyone knew it. Husbands who wanted new wives, families who wanted to claim inheritance, business rivals who wanted to destroy competitors, all could use accusations of female adultery as weapons. The woman's actual guilt or innocence was irrelevant. The accusation itself was enough, because the real crime was not adultery. The real crime was being female in a world that saw female autonomy as an existential threat. Consider the stark mathematics of these punishments. Men who committed adultery faced fines, perhaps temporary exile, occasionally social embarrassment. Women faced death, mutilation, slavery. Men's adultery was considered a minor weakness. Women's adultery was considered a crime against nature, God, and society itself. This disparity reveals that the punishments were never about morality or justice. They were about control. The methods of punishment tell us what each society feared most about female sexuality: drowning and burial alive reflected fears of female sexuality as a force of nature that must be completely suppressed. Mutilation revealed anxiety about female beauty as a source of dangerous power. Forced prostitution showed terror at the idea of female sexual agency by turning it into its complete opposite. Each punishment was designed to take what was feared about women and destroy it utterly. The involvement of entire communities in these punishments served to make everyone complicit. By forcing people to watch, to participate, to throw stones or earth or insults, society ensured that everyone became part of the system of control. Those who might feel sympathy were made into accomplices. Those who might protest were silenced by their own participation. The crowd became unified in its cruelty, bonded by shared violence against a common victim. The religious justifications wrapped these horrors in divine authority. Whether Christian, Islamic, Hindu, or pagan, religious leaders proclaimed these punishments as God's will. They transformed torture into sacrament, murder into divine justice, abuse into holy punishment. This religious sanctioning made resistance not just dangerous, but blasphemous. To oppose the punishment of adulteresses was to oppose God himself. But perhaps most horrifying is how recent many of these practices are. The last legal drowning of an adulteress in Europe was in 1734. Nose-cutting continues today in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Stoning for adultery remains legal in over a dozen countries. Forced prostitution of condemned women continues in various forms worldwide. These are not ancient histories. They are recent, and in some cases, current events. The legacy of these punishments extends far beyond the individual women who suffered them. They created cultures of silence where women learned never to speak about desire, never to acknowledge sexuality, never to assert autonomy. They created generations of women who policed themselves and each other out of terror of accusation. They normalized violence against women as moral and necessary. They turned female suffering into public entertainment. Modern violence against women for perceived sexual transgressions carries the echo of these historical punishments. Honor killings, acid attacks, revenge porn, slut-shaming all descend from the same impulse that created drowning cages and burning stakes. The methods have changed, but the underlying message remains. Women's sexuality must be controlled, and any woman who defies that control must be destroyed as a warning to others. The women who suffered these punishments were not nameless victims. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, human beings with hopes and dreams and lives that were destroyed by accusations they often could not defend against. Each woman who was drowned, burned, mutilated, or enslaved was an individual tragedy multiplied by thousands, millions across history. Their suffering was real, immediate, and undeserved. We remember kings and wars, conquests and discoveries. The names of generals and emperors fill our history books. But for countless women throughout history, the real story was not battles or politics, but survival under constant threat of accusation and punishment. They lived knowing that a single word from the wrong person could lead to drowning cages or burning stakes. They raised daughters knowing they were raising potential victims. They loved carefully, lived carefully, died carefully. The courage of women who survived in these conditions cannot be overstated. Every woman who lived through these eras and managed to find moments of joy, who raised children with love, who created beauty or meaning in their lives despite the constant threat, was committing an act of incredible bravery. They resisted not through revolution but through resilience, not through violence but through endurance. Today, when we debate women's rights, bodily autonomy, sexual freedom, we must remember that these are not abstract concepts. They are protections against the very real horrors that women faced throughout history when they lacked these rights. Every protection of female autonomy is a barrier against returning to drowning cages and burning stakes. Every assertion of women's sexual agency is a rejection of the control that once led to mutilation and slavery. The bones of drowned women lie in riverbeds across Europe. The ashes of burned women are mixed with the soil of 1,000 town squares. The unmarked graves of women buried alive dot the countryside. The descendants of mutilated women carry genetic trauma in their cells. These women deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who deserved better from their societies, their religions, their families. Their voices were silenced by water, by fire, by earth, by blade. But their stories survive as warnings, not to women about the price of transgression, but to humanity about the price of cruelty. They remind us that civilization is not measured by architectural achievements or military might, but by how it treats its most vulnerable members. By that measure, most of human history has been deeply, profoundly uncivilized. The scars still linger in our collective memory, in our inherited traumas, in the ways women still fear accusation, still police their own sexuality, still carry the weight of thousands of years of punishment for the crime of being female. These scars will take generations more to heal, if they ever fully heal at all. But perhaps by remembering, by forcing ourselves to confront the full horror of what was done, by refusing to sanitize or minimize these cruelties, we can begin to ensure they are never repeated. Perhaps by naming the torture as torture, the murder as murder, the injustice as injustice, we can start to build a world where no woman fears the drowning cage, the burning stake, the mutilating blade. The woman in that Florence marketplace in 1492 died 4 days after her public humiliation. She died from infection in the wounds caused by stones thrown by her neighbors. She died calling for her children, who were not allowed to come to her. She died without last rites because the church considered her too sinful to deserve them. Her name was Lucretia. She was 23 years old. She was accused by a husband who wanted to marry his pregnant mistress. She was probably innocent. Remember her. Remember all of them, not for their supposed crimes, but for their humanity. They were not cautionary tales. They were human beings. They deserved better. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice, even if that justice comes centuries too late. The history of the world is written in women's blood, carved into women's bodies, screamed in women's voices that no one bothered to record. It is a history of profound, systematic, unrelenting cruelty, justified by law, sanctified by religion, celebrated by communities. It is a history that should shame us all. But it is also a history of survival, of women who endured the unendurable, who faced tortures designed to break them and somehow remained unbroken in spirit, if not in body. It is a history of quiet resistance, of women who protected each other when no one else would, who whispered truths when lies were safer, who chose to keep living when death would have been easier. These women, these millions of forgotten women, were the true architects of survival. They built not monuments of stone, but networks of support. They created not empires, but moments of tenderness in the midst of horror. They left not written records, but genetic memories of trauma and resilience that we carry in our cells today. When we look back at history and wonder how humans could have been so cruel, we must also look forward and ask what cruelties we are perpetrating today that future generations will view with the same horror. What punishments do we inflict on women now that will seem barbaric centuries from now? What controls do we accept as normal that will be recognized as torture by our descendants? The drowning cages are museum pieces now. The burning stakes are archaeological sites. The mutilation blades are kept in historical collections. But the impulse that created them, the desire to control women through violence and fear, that impulse is not safely in the past. It lives on in every act of violence against women, every attempt to control female sexuality, every punishment that falls harder on women than men for the same actions. History's message is clear. When we allow women's bodies to become battlegrounds for social control, when we turn female sexuality into a crime, when we punish women for men's fears, we create horrors that echo through generations. The water that drowned those women still flows in our rivers. The fire that burned them still burns in our hearts. The earth that buried them is the same earth we walk on today. We cannot resurrect the dead. We cannot undo the torture. We cannot erase the scars. But we can remember. We can learn. We can swear by all that is holy and human that these horrors will not be repeated, that no woman will again face the drowning cage for the crime of being accused, that no girl will grow up fearing her sexuality could lead to her destruction. This is what we owe to Lucretia and the millions like her. Not pity, but justice. Not silence, but truth. Not forgetting, but eternal, unwavering remembrance of what happens when fear of female autonomy is allowed to become law, to become tradition, to become normal. Their bones cry out from the earth. Their ashes swirl in the wind. Their blood has long since washed away. But their stories remain, waiting to be told, demanding to be heard, insisting that we face the full horror of what humanity is capable of when it declares war on half of its own population. Remember them, honor them, and swear that their suffering will not have been in vain. This is the least we owe to the countless women who died in drowning cages and burning stakes, who lived in mutilated bodies and enslaved conditions, who suffered punishments that should never have existed for crimes that should never have been crimes. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.